our summer webinar series. We're going to talk about native plants today. I hope everybody's enjoying this slightly cooler weather. I know I certainly am. My name is Shane Kiefer. Here with Plateau Land and Wildlife, and we got quite a crowd here today. So and quite a lot to talk about. Tried to jam as much in here as I could, and hopefully can get through it in an hour and get y'all back to your day. But hopefully there's something in here that you can take with you and apply. I'll try to get to questions if we have time at the end. But if I don't get to your question, if you have one, you can always, of course, just shoot us an email, give us a call, and I'd be happy to answer those for you. And let me get my controls down here. Gotta figure out how to move the next one. Here we go. All right. Sorry about that. So today we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you some resources we find helpful for plant identification, because obviously we can't go through too many plants in a 1-hour webinar. So hopefully you can take away that and start to learn to identify plants on your own. I assume that's why you're here, because you're interested in learning a little more about being able to identify plants on your property. I am going to talk about some of the more common and what I'll call important grasses that can give you an indication of how healthy your property is. And we'll talk a little bit about a sample of wildflower families with some examples. And I'll explain why we're going to talk about families as opposed to individuals more in just a bit. So we'll start real basic, just to give you an overview. If you remember from high school biology, this is a basic taxonomic structure from kingdom down to species. And with plants, if you can get down to the family, and families have typically some unique characteristics. If you can get that plant down to the family, then you've got a lot smaller list of pictures and things to go through to identify what you're looking at. So that's a really helpful way to start to identify plants on your own. So we'll spend quite a bit of time, especially on the flowers and forbs, talking about plant families. And again, some examples from each of those families. And these families, again, are grouped based on common characteristics and their evolutionary relationships, right? So when we first started classifying things, we did it mainly based on appearance, but of course, organisms that look similar aren't always closely related. So now it's really based on their evolutionary history and how closely related they are genetically. And that's how we group things. But because they're closely related, they tend to share characteristics, and that can help us get to those family groups pretty easily. There are exceptions to everything. Plants are variable, just like animals are, and so there are always exceptions to these rules. So, but I think it'll give you a good starting point to quickly start to pick out some of the more common families. So how do you go about identifying plants? Of course, you can ask someone. You can ask a biologist, a consultant. You can go to the real experts, the plant systematists and botanists at a local university. Botanical garden staff usually is a good place to go. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center here in Austin has a great staff. And that's a great place to learn plants, actually, is to go and walk around the Wildflower Center and see plants in the wild, in the field at least, where you can see what they really look like. When I was learning plants in school, we did a lot of dried specimens on paper. They look very different when they're growing in the ground than they do when they're dried on a piece of paper. So looking at them in the field or in gardens and wildflower centers, those are great places to see what they really look like when they're grown on your property. Master naturalists, friends and family who may be botanists or amateur botanists can be helpful too. This middle method, comparison method, that's really going to be your go-to. You look at what you've got, you're trying to identify, and compare it to pictures in a field guide, pictures online, descriptions you might find. And of course, it's easy to take pictures now. You can take lots of pictures. And by that, I mean, take lots of pictures. Even if you're getting help from somebody else, multiple pictures of the plant from the whole plant, the flowers of the plant, the leaves of the plant. Those all will make it easier for someone to help you identify it and make it easier for you to identify it. And I'm going to mention iNaturalist again at the end. That's a fantastic tool, relatively new, that kind of speeds up this comparison method. You take a picture, upload it into the app, and the computer does a lot of work for you, trying to match it to known pictures and make suggestions for you. And you can, at the same time, ask someone, because there's a social aspect to it where other folks can suggest identifications for those pictures. It's a great tool if you're interested in plants or any living organism, trying to identify those around you. iNaturalist is worth checking out. There are taxonomic keys which make it fast and easy to get an accurate identification, but they require quite a bit of practice. You've got to know the vocabulary, you've got to know how to use them, understand plant anatomy to make those really functional for you. So we're not going to spend time on taxonomic keys today, but that is one. As you advance, you may start to use some of those, and you'll see them in some more advanced field guides as well. So we're going to talk a lot about plant families today. And the way you know it's a plant family is it ends in A.C.E. Easy way to remember that is to pronounce it A.C.E. So Poaceae, Asteraceae. Now that is not the correct Latin pronunciation, I'm pretty sure, but I'm not a Latin scholar. And that's easy to remember and close enough. Even most scientists don't know how to pronounce Latin properly. So A.C.E. works well. Just remember that. Fabaceae gives you the plant family. We're going to start with grasses and spend a fair amount of time here. This is one that people tend to overlook. Grass is a grass, right? You know what a grass looks like. We don't need to necessarily talk about too much about how to get something into the grass family. If it looks like a grass, it's probably a grass. But grasses do have usually hollow stems called the culm. That's just the stem that comes out of the ground, right? That's the above ground portion of the stem of the plant. The inflorescence is the flower part of the plant. It's the top where the seeds are and the flowers are. And then the spikelet, which is the little pieces at the end of those branches on the inflorescence. That's kind of the basic unit of it. That's and you're going to see these terms in a lot of field guides, which is why I've mentioned them here. So let's jump into some common ones. We're not going to go through all of these, but I wanted to give you a brief list here of common Central Texas grasses. Now, a lot of these occur throughout a large portion of the state. So no matter where you are, you've got some, if not all of these in your area. Those four bold ones with the asterisks are what we call our big four prairie grasses. Those were the dominant grasses on the tall grass prairies that stretched across the entire middle of North America at one time. Almost all of that is gone, at least in its native form. It's been converted either to crops or to non-native pastures, but we've certainly got remnants, and these plants are still around, just not nearly as abundant as they used to be. So we'll talk about those four as well as some others that I think might be helpful to you. Those last two, King Ranch Bluestem and Bermuda grass, those are a couple of non-native grasses I'm going to mention just because you've almost certainly got them on your property, depending on where you are, one or both of them, actually. And they are important to know because they tell you something about the state of your property. Those non-native grasses, of course, are generally undesirable from a wildlife perspective because they tend to dominate. They tend to choke out natives, and they don't provide a lot of wildlife value in and of themselves. So even though they may grow well and produce a lot of vegetation, they don't provide a whole lot of wildlife value, and they choke out other things that are important for wildlife. I'm going to start right at the top with big bluestem. This is the big prairie grass. This is big, tall, strong grass. And I've got some pictures here coming up for you, but it's up to head height or taller. Can be quite impressive. Big colonies of it, 10 feet or more across. It's got what's called a typical turkey foot inflorescence, that seed head, which you'll see in a minute. Beautiful blue-green stems when it's growing. And this is what's called an ice cream plant. It's something that cows will eat before they eat anything else. They're going to go hit the ice cream first. Now that's not ice cream in nutrition, that's ice cream in taste. It's also highly nutritious and essentially a complete meal for a cow, and it tastes great, which is why they tend to focus on it. And so it tends to be limited in areas where you've got continuous heavy grazing. Tends to disappear. But it's also one that in years like this, when we've got lots of rain, it may pop up in an area where you've never seen it. I've seen quite a bit of big bluestem this year, see it in years when we get lots of rain. So those seeds are there. And if your land's resting, if you're in wildlife and you're not grazing livestock, then you may see some big bluestem popping up where you've never seen it before. This is big bluestem, big, tall, robust grass. You can see heavy stems, that nice blue-green color, and there on the right you can see that turkey foot pattern. Now, not all of them have three. Sometimes it'll have 4 spikes or 4 branches or more, but typically 3. If you see this, it's going to stand out out in your pasture. You're going to notice this stand head and shoulders above most of those other grasses. So it's really easy to pick out when it's growing and easy to identify at that point. You can get up and find that. It'll catch your eye from a distance, and when you get up close and find that turkey foot pattern and that nice blue-green color, you'll know you've got big bluestem. Indiangrass, this is one of the prettier grasses in my opinion. Important one to note, again, just like big bluestem, if you've got it, it's an indicator of either improving or good range conditions. It's another one that cows really like to eat, and so in heavy grazing, it tends to disappear. See a lot of this on the roadsides where it's protected from grazing, where it's got a little more moisture in the bar ditches. That bluish green color, that light blue-green color is really distinctive. You can pick this out even without a seed head, which grasses without seed heads are often difficult to identify because a grass looks like a grass, right? But when you've, even without those seed heads, Indiangrass tends to stand out because of that really nice light blue-green color. So it can be easy to pick out even this time of year. It's got that golden brown seed head at the top. You can see here, and I've got a close-up of that on the next slide. So very distinctive. There's really not anything else that looks like Indiangrass. It stands out when it's in flower. So pretty easy one to identify and a good one to note. If you got Indiangrass on your property, that's a good sign. Birds like to eat the seeds, including turkeys, and it provides good cover for wildlife as well. Okay. A couple of pictures of Indiangrass. Here you've got the seed, that golden brown seed head here on the left. And again, very distinctive. There's really not anything else that looks quite like that. And then off to the right, you can see it's typically a pretty tall, robust grass, but not always. This is perhaps a little shadier area where this one on the right is growing. So it's a little stunted, but still present. You can still see that one's color's a little off there, but it's got that lighter bluish green color, and those golden seed heads stand out quite a bit. Switchgrass, another of the big 4, and aside from little bluestem, which we'll talk about next, probably the second most common of the big 4 that we still have around. This is a big grass, big tall grass, well above head height usually. Again, that similar, you'll notice a lot of these have a bluish green growth. This one's not as sharp and electric as the others. Turns kind of reddish orange in winter. You've seen switchgrass, also common on roadsides. Very common now in riparian areas along creeks, rivers, and streams. It does well there. It tends to be maybe a little better protected from grazing, and it is an excellent erosion control grass in those areas. Very important stabilizing grass along our rivers and streams. They form big stands, and the root systems are thick and extensive and hold soil as well as anything else. The folks that rate the soil holding capabilities of plants rate switchgrass right up there with something like a big cypress tree. Really strong root system that holds things in place. So even in big floods, stands of switchgrass will resist being washed away and rotting away. Switchgrass can be mistaken for one of our non-natives, Johnson grass. Looks somewhat similar, same rough size and structure, but Johnson grass, as you'll see on the next slide, has a couple of characteristics that separate it. Once you can separate them out, you won't mistake them for each other. So we got switchgrass here on the left in the center. That's a close-up. You can see that big spreading panicle, lots of little seeds at the ends on the tips of those branches on that seed head. And that's typical of the panicums. There's lots of different panicums. They all have that similar type of seed structure and tend to have that open seed head like that. This is one of the bigger panicums. And so that big spreading seed head, a little taller than it is wide, big robust grass there in the center. Again, that's kind of a good growth form picture. Tall, that'll be above your head. It stands out as well, typically in most areas. And that's Johnson grass there on the far right. And I'll, if I can get my drawing tool here, you can see, if you look closely, you can see this white mid vein here. Now, you're not going to see that on switchgrass. If you look over on the left, there is no white mid vein there, so it's green like the rest of the leaf. Johnson grass has that pale white mid vein, and that seed head you can see a little more reddish brown, and the seeds look different than they do on switchgrass. A little bigger spikelets than on switchgrass. So again, once you learn to tell the difference, you won't mistake them for each other too easily. I got to get back to. I got to close this before I can move to the next slide. And I should probably erase some of that. It leaves those on there. Give me just a second, folks. I'm going to erase these. All right, little bluestem. Now, little bluestem is still the most common of our big four grasses. Still very widespread and abundant in a lot of places. And very common, a good indicator of range health. If you got lots of little bluestem, then that's a good indicator that your property's in pretty good health, at least as far as from a grass standpoint. The nice thing about little bluestem is that in the fall and winter, it turns into this nice wine red color. You can see all the little clumps of little bluestem here throughout this picture in the foreground and the background. That wine red color, brownish red color, is a good way to pick out little bluestem. So it's really easy to pick out. Out in pasture, stands out pretty strongly. You can see the fresh growth on some of those. It's not that color, but once you get a good frost, it turns that nice wine red, and that's last year's growth you're seeing on those plants. There's fresh green growth coming underneath, but that's last year's growth. And so it makes it easy to pick out, probably easier than any of these once you know to spot it. You can spot it driving down the highway at 70 miles an hour, no problem. This one's a little shorter, usually about hip height, but it can get up to head height as well. But typically, around hip height. So the shortest of the four big prairie grasses. And its seed heads are a little different than those others we looked at as well. It's got little spikes instead of those bigger, more open panicles. And this is excellent ground nesting cover. Very important grass for a lot of reasons, but one of which is it's great for quail nests, great for other ground nesting birds. Those big, thick clumps are great places to hide a nest, and the more clumps you have, the more places there are to hide nests, and the harder it is for predators to find them. So, good one to see. You want to get out there and look around. This is really common throughout the Edwards Plateau and the post oak savanna in particular. Very, very common and often dominant grass as far as natives go. Few more pictures, a little bluestem here, and here on the left you can see the general growth form. Again, strong bunches rather than spreading out very wide. It forms these isolated bunches, and that's important because that space in between is space for small wildlife to move. It's space for other plants to grow as well. So good strong bunches there. You can see those spike-like seed heads there in the center picture. A little bit different than any of the other three we've looked at so far. Kind of fluffy white seeds on those little spikes, and that nice electric, almost purple, blue, green color on that fresh growth there on the right. Very distinctive, and it really helps it stand out. The color often looks similar to big bluestem, but that growth structure, again, tends to be very different. Strong, tight bunches, typically little bluestem. Big bluestem may be a little more spread out into a colony. Gamagrass, I put this one in here just because it's probably my favorite grass. Very distinctive and a fantastic native grass. As far as the quality and quantity of forage that it produces, there's really not one that beats it. As you'll see coming up, big, strong, wide leaves, and long and wide both. So lots of leaf matter for grazing animals. And so it tends again to be favored by livestock where it occurs. This is a big grass, 10 feet or more tall. So it really stands out as well above a lot of our smaller native grasses and all of our non-native grasses in this area really too. So really stands out. Also a very valuable riparian grass. Good strong root systems, helps protect against erosion. And provides excellent cover. Those seeds are valuable as well. You can see in the lower left there, those big seeds almost look like corn kernels. Those are from the female flowers on the bottom of that spike. Those male flowers you see out there on the right picture up at the top, those are the male flowers, and the females are down below. And those seeds form at the base there, tip of that stalk, and break off into those kernel-like structures. So nothing else really that looks like that. If you get one with a seed head on it, you're not going to mistake it for anything else. A few more pictures of eastern gamagrass. You can see a big, robust grass there in the center. That's tall, heavy, thick, wide leaves. It really stands out. Looks more like some of our non-native tropical invaders, like giant reed, than it does anything else. But you're not going to mistake it for that. And big, healthy, thick colonies. You can see there strong bunching formation on the left, and that seed head, that very distinctive seed head on the far right, that kind of looks like scales or kernels. And again, very unique. Really going to stand out to you when you see it. Again, look for this in riparian areas along creeks, rivers, and streams. There's large swaths of the Guadalupe River where it'll form big colonies and protect against erosion, and also provide a lot of great wildlife habitat, but common throughout central and east Texas as well. Sideoats. This is our state grass. If you didn't know, we have a state grass, an official state grass. May not surprise you, we have official state almost everything, but this is our state grass, one to be proud of, and a good one, a good indicator grass, especially in central Texas. You may be missing some of those previous big grasses I talked about, like big bluestem and eastern gamagrass, but you've likely got Sideoats grama on the place, especially if you're well on the road to recovery. What's distinctive about Sideoats is the seed head, the spikelets all hang off to one side, which kind of looks like oats, hence the name. And so it's really distinctive in that case. Also provides good forage. It's a very adaptable grass, grows in a wide range of soil types, common in reseeding mixes because of that. Does really well in a lot of different locations. And this is not a real tall grass. This is going to be a knee-high or maybe thigh-high grass, typically, maybe up to hip height at the biggest. So a little shorter, but very distinctive seed head that you can pick out. And of course, wildlife do use the seeds, and the good bunch grass form can provide good cover for nesting as well. Here's a couple of pictures of Sideoats. You can see on the left there, those seed, those spikelets tend to hang off to one side. of that central stem. These are a little spread out, but they're still kind of drooping to one side, and you can really see on the right picture how they hang off and favor one direction, making it look like a stand of oats. So again, very easy to pick out when it's in seed, as are a lot of these native grasses that we've talked about so far. Silver bluestem. This one's important because it's very common. You've almost certainly got some silver bluestem on your place. It's not necessarily a great grazing grass or a great wildlife grass, but it is some indication to you that your property may be undergoing a little bit of recovery. It's usually one of the first ones to pop back up after heavy grazing, once you get some rest on a property, or after a drought comes on pretty strong, and will come up pretty quickly. That helps set the stage for some of these other higher quality grasses, and it tends to reduce over time. If you continue to rest or manage the grazing properly, those other grasses will kind of outcompete it, and it'll decline. But a good indicator grass for you, and it stands out. It's got this fluffy white seed heads, fairly easy to identify because of that cottony, almost fluffy seed head. And to me, when you crush those seed, if you take that seed head and crush it between your fingers, it's got kind of an orange scent to it, which can be a good way to confirm that what you think you're looking at is silver bluestem. Couple other pictures. Again, you've almost certainly seen this grass on your property. Those fluffy white seed heads are pretty distinctive. It can form some pretty good bunches and provide good nesting cover, as you see on the right. And so it can be a good cover grass, even though it's not excellent for grazing or anything. I'm going to talk about a few cool season grasses real quick, just because these are important as they're growing in a different season, of course, than all the other grasses we've talked about. Those other grasses are all warm season grasses, which means that their growing season is from essentially spring to fall. They're going to seed out in the fall and complete their growth then. Cool season grasses cover the other part of the year, from fall through the spring or early summer. So they're nice and green during the winter. So when you're out on your property during the winter, you're seeing green grass. It's going to be likely one of these cool season grasses. There are a lot of different cool season grasses. Texas wintergrass is the most common, probably native cool season grass we've got in most areas. This is the speargrass that I used to throw at my friends when I was a young boy. And so you probably recognize it as that. It's got those spear-like seeds that you can toss and stick to people's clothes and provide a little poke. It's also got, before it goes to seed, it's got these rough leaves. You can see these fine hairs on the right. And if you run your fingers up and down that leaf, it's rough on the top and the bottom. And that can be a helpful indicator for you if it's not in seed. So you see a green grass in the winter, and you got that rough top and bottom leaf, and it's fairly abundant. It's likely Texas wintergrass, and provides fairly good forage. In the winter, it's one of the few things that's green, and so wildlife will use it during that time when nothing else is growing, when everything else is dormant. And the seeds are used by turkeys and other birds as well. A couple of pictures of wintergrass here. You can see those spears on the left. The shaft of those spears is what's called an awn, and you'll see that terminology used in field guides for grasses and other plants. But those awns, it's just a long extension off that spikelet, and so wintergrass just has really long ones, and that's what makes it a spear-like sort of thing. So long flowing, you can see them on the right, those long distinctive awns hanging out. That's really what's going to tell you that that's a Texas wintergrass. There are other species with long awns. Some of them curl. Wintergrass tends to have some of the longest, and so it stands out as pretty distinctive because of that. And again, green during the winter. It's typically going to go to seed in the spring, early summer. Once it cures in the late spring or early summer, it goes from green to kind of a real light pale straw color, and can be fairly distinctive then too. Wildrye is another great cool season grass, common one. There's a couple of species. This is Canada Wildrye. We've also got Virginia Wildrye, which is pretty common here in Texas. And I'll show you the difference, one difference here in just a second. But Wildryes have that kind of distinctive grain, cereal grain looking head. As you can see, it's got awns too, as you can see on there, just like speargrass does. It's got extended awns, but not nearly as long as Texas wintergrass is. And it's also got these, let me show you here, these clasping leaves here. They kind of wrap around the stem a little bit, which can be distinctive. If it doesn't have that seed head yet, those clasping leaves can help you identify this as a Wildrye. The difference really between Canada Wildrye and Virginia Wildrye, Canada Wildrye 1 has slightly longer awns, though that's not terribly helpful if you don't have one to compare it to. Okay, but slightly longer awns. But more importantly, what it does is when Canada Wildrye matures, and you can see that here on the right. So this is Canada Wildrye on the right. You can see that the seed heads tend to curl as they mature, and that can really make it easy to identify Wildrye. That's Virginia Wildrye on the left. I apologize for the blurriness of that. I took that in a hurry and low light, actually yesterday evening on a walk with my daughter, and it's blurry, but you can see that seed head, even though it's mature, stays straight and erect. So that's Virginia Wildrye on the left. Canada Wildrye has those drooping, curled seed heads there on the right, but look very, very similar to each other. So you can get it down to Wildrye pretty quickly. And I'll answer this. I got a question. I'll go ahead and answer now. Oh, Molly just answered it for me. Yeah, the slides will be available. I realize that we got to move through this fairly fast because we've only got an hour, but these slides will be available so you can refer back to those and use them for comparisons and to remind you of what you're looking at as you're out in the field trying to find some of these things. Those non-native grasses I mentioned, King Ranch Bluestem and Bermuda grass, I want you to know what they look like just because, one, they're common, and two, you really want to be able to separate those from native grass. Not all grass is created equal. We're generally trying to encourage natives and discourage non-natives. So King Ranch Bluestem has these distinctive purple seed heads that you'll see. This is really common roadside grass. It was planted by TxDOT for many years because it's a pretty good soil holder. It grows well. It withstands mowing really well. And so it was used for a long time to reseed our highway right-of-ways. Not anymore, but it's still very, very abundant and very common. And so when you're driving down the highway, seeing those kind of waving purple heads of grass, that's King Ranch Bluestem almost certainly. Bermuda grass, most of you know, it's in a lot of your lawns probably. It's a sod forming grass, so it grows low to the ground and spreads out instead of forming those bunches. And it's got kind of a bird, what's described as a bird's foot seed head, which I'll show you in a minute. Bermuda grass is good grazing grass. That's why it's grown for hay commonly. But it doesn't really provide any wildlife value at all. It's the seeds aren't of much use. It's too dense typically for wildlife to use thick stands of Bermuda grass, and it chokes out a lot of native plants that you'd rather see growing there. So so this is Bermuda grass here. Those two on the left, you can see that bird's foot kind of seed head on a Bermuda grass. If you've got it, this is a common one. You've seen it in lots of places, lots of lawns, and on lots of properties. That low green growth to the ground there. And then King Ranch Bluestem here on the right, you can see those purple seed heads that really kind of stand out. If you see that purple seed headed, kind of knee-high, thigh-high grass, that's most likely King Ranch Bluestem. Good place to find it is, well, almost anywhere, but again, drive down pretty much any roadside in Central Texas and you'll see it. Again, it likes mowing, so the areas where TxDOT frequently mows, King Ranch Bluestem tends to be the dominant grass there. And you can tell where they stop mowing typically, because that's where a lot of times you'll see, at least in the Edwards Plateau and the post oak savanna, you'll see little bluestem popping up where the mower can't go, or where they stop mowing, because it does not withstand that mowing very well. Certainly not as well as King Ridge bluestem. So good one for roadside botany. Now I mentioned you know a grass when you see one, right? Because a grass looks like a grass. Well, here's one exception, and that's sedges. Sedges look like grasses too, but they're not grasses. So I want you to be just quickly familiar with sedges. Pretty easy to separate them from most grasses, even though they look like it. You can see there in that picture, that's on the lower left, that's cedar sedge, which is a really common one throughout a lot of Texas, especially central Texas. Looks like a little clump of grass if you just walking by it. But sedges have triangular stems. So the saying is sedges have edges, right? So if you roll a grass stem between your fingers, it's round and smooth. If you roll a sedge stem between your fingers, not the leaf, but the stem, where the seed's coming off, you're going to feel those triangular edges. It's really distinctive. It's not hard to separate those two. So if you see something growing in a moist area, particularly sedges like moist areas, that looks kind of like a funny little clump of grass, check that stem and see if it's triangular. If it is, you got a sedge. Sedges are, while they're not very, most of them don't have very impressive seed heads. Some of them are quite attractive and do form bigger seed heads and are used in landscaping. So some of them can be quite pretty, but a lot of them are nondescript little grass-like plants that you probably often just overlook and assume it's some kind of little grass. All right, so we're going to talk about forbs here, and if you've talked to a biologist, you've heard that term forbs, and if you didn't stop them and ask, then you may have been left wondering what that was. But a forb is just an herbaceous plant. It's not a grass or a sedge, right? So it's not a woody plant, not a shrub or a tree, and not a grass or sedge. So this is all your flowers, and a lot of plants that you might consider weeds. A lot of them have weed in the name, as a matter of fact, as you can see from this list. But these are all of our wildflowers that we enjoy looking at in the spring and summer are forbs. Got some pretty ones on here, like orange zexmania, Texas lantana, common landscape plant that is also a forb, a native forb as well. Has that one's kind of an in-between. It's got some woody stems to it, but it's not really a woody plant. Milkweeds like antelope horn and green milkweed, which we'll talk about, are important for a lot of our pollinators and our milkweed butterflies. And then, what we consider, most people would consider real weeds, like silverleaf nightshade and two-leaf senna, that generally are discouraged, especially in a grazing situation, because they can be toxic. But those are forbs too. Those are wildflowers just like these others. They're just not as well loved as some of these others. Okay? And we're not going to go through each of those individually, but again, I'm going to talk about the families. I'm going to talk about how to maybe get down to that family level with some of the common families. This is not all of them. There's 268 plant families in North America, so we can't go through all of them, even all the ones in Texas. But I'm going to go through some of the more common ones, and again, ones I think show some importance on your property. The biggest one, just about, is the sunflower family, Asteraceae. And if you know what a sunflower looks like, or you know what a dandelion looks like, that's what an aster looks like. They're pretty variable in color and size, but they all share this characteristic of having composite flowers. And what that means is that flower you're looking at, that sunflower you're looking at, is not one flower. That is a bunch of tiny flowers all packed together to look like one single flower. As a matter of fact, it's got both disc flowers, so that's central disc in a sunflower or a dandelion. The center disc, that's a bunch of tiny little disc flowers packed together, each of which has its own flower parts. And those petals, what look like petals on the outside of the flower, are actually individual flowers as well. Each of those is an individual flower called a ray flower. So all those asters share that characteristic. And if you think about, again, a sunflower, just because of the size and it's easy to visualize, all those sunflower seeds that are packed on that sunflower head, each of those seeds came from one flower. So that may give you a picture of how these composites work. They're often in a disc, flat disc shape, but there are round discs as well, things like pincushion daisy, round disc shapes, and a wide variety of, again, of colors and sizes here. Some common ones, and you can see how different some of these look from each other, but all asters. Texas up there on the upper left corner, that's Texas skeleton plant. Pretty little aster, purple aster. Indian blanket there in the top center. Also, again, an aster, you can see those red and yellow ray flowers, and then those disc flowers packed in the center. Far right is common sunflower, and just an annual sunflower, which I'm sure you all know. You can see there each of those yellow petal-like structures is an individual flower. And you can actually see in that central disc there, that brown central disc, you can see that those disc flowers actually putting out anthers. You can see the pollen, the yellow pollen dots there on those disc flowers. So again, each of those individual little flowers. Blackfoot daisy in the center on the bottom, those little white flowers with the yellow centers. That's a common landscape plant, good one for xeriscaping, grows well in really poor soils, can be very attractive and form pretty dense clusters of white aster flowers. And then fleabane there on the bottom left. And fleabanes tend to look pretty distinctive too. They've all got these really fine ray flowers. So those white petal-like ray flowers tend to be really fine, really packed in there tight, kind of like a wire brush wheel. That's what I think of anyway. And that's a good way to just get not only to the family aster, but to get to a fleabane. If it's got those really finely divided ray flowers, these tend to be very small plants. It's probably a fleabane. They look pretty distinctive in and of themselves. So that can help you get down to that level. But if it looks kind of like any of these, got that central disc and those outer ray petals. Again, some of them don't have those ray flowers at all. So it's just a central disc with a bunch of flowers packed in. And if you pick them apart with your hands, if you take one of those flowers and start to pull it apart, you'll see all those individual little flowers in that disc. It kind of falls apart into a bunch of little pieces. Then you've got an aster. So pretty easy one to get to family, at least. Milkweeds are important for a lot of our pollinators. Again, especially our milkweed butterflies like monarchs. And milkweeds are, again, tend to be, if they weren't good for pollinators, they'd certainly just be considered weeds, although some of them can be quite attractive and are used in landscaping as well. Milkweeds, of course, have that milky substance inside them. If you break them open, you got that milky sap. They are toxic. That's why those milkweed butterflies like them. Their caterpillars feed on the leaves and pick up a nasty taste, and so predators learn to avoid them. And so that's why they're really important to that group of butterflies, at least. And they're used by a lot of pollinators, not just those milkweed butterflies, but they're host plants for those butterflies, for the caterpillars to feed on. Okay. They all tend to have those kind of five, you see in the center there in the picture, 5 sepals, 5 petals, and 5 kind of hoods. So 5, 5, and 5. I'll show you an example of that here next. So this, of course, is antelope horn milkweed on the left. Very common, especially in the plateau. Very common milkweed to find, grown on range. That's, of course, not a monarch, though we think of antelope horn and monarchs. That's a queen butterfly, but they use them as well. And so antelope horn, very common one. If I can get my drawing tools here, I will try to point out. So on the antelope horn, you can see here on these unbloomed flowers, you can kind of count that it's kind of a pentagon shape, a 5-sided. That's those 5. In this case, that's the sepals, because these haven't opened up yet, and they'll open up here, if you look on the right, into 5 petals and those 5 coronas here. So 5, 5, and 5. You can count those pretty easily, even in this picture. That's typical of milkweed flowers. Okay, but antelope really stands out. These big umbrella-shaped flower heads on antelope horn milkweed. That umbrella shape is pretty typical of milkweeds as well. Though they're not all umbrella shaped. This is green milkweed here on the right. Another native milkweed we've got, and that's more of a ball-shaped flower head. But again, if you were to pick these apart, you'd find that 5 sepals, 5 petals, and 5, you can, really hard to see here, but 5 hoods there around the outside, getting ready to pop open. So again, another important butterfly plant, green milkweed. And again, they tend to have leathery stems, leathery leaves, and that milky sap. And let me clear that stuff off so it doesn't carry over. Yeah, have that milky sap that gives them the name milkweed. Spurges. Spurges, one that may be one you haven't heard of, but spurges are a really important family of plants. The reason you may not have heard of them is because they tend to be pretty plain. They're generally nondescript little flowers. They can be big plants. As a matter of fact, spurges, some spurges are even trees, but they tend to be not very showy flowers, but they're an important class of plants. For wildlife, the seeds in a lot of spurge species are very valuable to birds. Spurges also have a milky kind of sap, but you can see both the flowers and the seeds will be very different from a milkweed. So you break it open, you got that sap, and it doesn't look like a milkweed. It's likely a spurge. A lot of these are toxic or poisonous as well. But the seeds, there are certainly animals that utilize them, and the seeds are really important, as I mentioned. Tend to have plain, simple leaves. A couple of examples here. On the right here, this is bull nettle. Now, this may be a spurge, even if you didn't know it was a spurge, you probably recognize bull nettle. If you don't, you should. You'll recognize it after you run into it because it hurts. And it does go through denim. I wear jeans in the field, and I've been hit by bull nettle many times right through my Wranglers. And so it's a little showy for a spurge, actually. It's got those white flowers. Now, those aren't petals. Those are actually sepals. Spurges typically don't have petals at all. So those aren't typical flower petals. They're white sepals. And so the rest of the flower there inside is not very big. But again, a little showier than most. And again, those nasty, stiff, sharp hairs on it that deliver that painful sting if you run into bull nettle. And then there on the left, I include this is Queen's Delight. This is another pretty common forb you'll see on a lot of properties. And I include it because it illustrates nicely this term you see up at the top here, this trilocular or 3-chambered ovary. I just like the word trilocular. I tried to avoid too much jargon here today, but that just means 3-chambered, but that's a fun one to say. And you can see, you can count those here. You got 1, 2, and then 3 in the back chambered. Now, this is pretty distinctive for spurges. That's a really good way to identify a spurge in the Forbs family, is it's got that 3-sided capsule. That's really pretty distinctive. So if you see a plant, nondescript, pretty plain looking, but it's got that 3-sided capsule, almost certainly a spurge. So good one. That's a good diagnostic character to know about. And I'll show you a couple more spurges that you've probably seen, almost certainly seen, one or both of these. On the left there, you've got Snow on the Prairie. Again, kind of a showy spurge. Most of the species are pretty nondescript, but this one's kind of showy. Those aren't white flowers on top. Those are white leaves at the top of the stems, but turn into a nice, pretty display when it's growing. So snow on the prairie, snow on the mountain, a similar species with those white-tipped leaves at the top. That's a spurge. And if you were to go pick those pollinated flowers off, you'd find that three-seeded capsule as well. And then that's woolly croton there on the right. And there's a lot of different crotons. And just knowing it's a croton is valuable. If you can get it down to croton, they all look very similar. Woolly croton has a lot of woolly hair on it, which is where it gets its name. But there are a lot of different croton species, all of which produce seeds that are valuable to birds and are readily used by especially doves. So a lot of them go by the common name of doveweed. That's your crotons. If you know doveweed, sometimes goatweed too, but doveweeds, I prefer that one. And if you know what a doveweed is, that's a croton, and crotons are spurges. And if you break those apart, again, you'll see that if you were to pick those fuzzy capsules off the top, you'd find they were three-sided, and they've got hard, shiny, brown-black seeds in them that are good for a lot of different seed-eating bird species. So, good one to know. Legumes. Legumes are a really important and again, a big group of plants, and go from not only forbs, but trees like mesquite are legumes in the same family, Fabaceae, and a lot of our wildflowers and other forbs are also legumes. So all of our pea plants are legume species, as you can see here in a picture. Into the pea branch of the legume family. And legumes are nitrogen fixers, which is one of the reasons they are important. So they improve soil health. They actually take nitrogen from the air and fix it into the soil. Think peanuts and peas. They put nitrogen back into the soil. And so good for that reason. Also good for pollinators. And the leaves tend to be high in protein. So they tend to be really good for deer as well. So most of your legumes are pretty palatable and pretty important deer plants because of the high protein content of those leaves. One thing to note about legumes is that they have compound leaves. And we didn't talk about leaf structure. Again, there's lots of different ways to take this seminar and do extensions of it. But in leaf structure, this compound leaf, that just means that this is one single leaf here on the right. That's not a bunch of tiny leaves. That's one big leaf. But what it has is a bunch of leaflets. So the leaf starts at the stem here. And all of this is one big leaf with a bunch of tiny leaflets on it. This is characteristic. Now, they don't all have a bunch. They may have 20 to 30 leaflets on some species. Some species only have 2 leaflets, but they're all compound leaves, just like this. And so that's a good way to at least get suspicion that it's a legume. It's not the only family or the only plant with compound leaves, but legumes do have those compound leaves. So that can be a helpful way to get down to family there. So our common legume species that probably the most famous of our legume forbs in Texas is the Texas bluebonnet, of course. It's a legume, and as many of you know, it's not terribly palatable for livestock to eat. It's a lupine in that genus, Lupinus. Lupines tend to be toxic to livestock as well, but again, important plant for pollinators. So not every legume is good to eat, but a lot of them certainly are. And that's two-leaf senna or twin-leaf senna there on the right. And that's, again, typically considered a weed, especially to cattle ranchers, because it's not good for livestock either. It can be toxic and tends to grow in really poor, heavily overgrazed pastures. So generally not one they want to see a lot of, but it is a legume just like these others. And I think when it's in flower, an attractive little plant. So the mint family, is, we know most of these because they're our culinary herbs, and they tend to be aromatic and smell nice and have showy flowers. Think lavender, and it's in the mint family or Lamiaceae, and they also have square stems, which is kind of unique. So getting a hold of the plant when you're trying to identify a plant, get a hold of it and note anything that's particular. So feel those stems. Square, I mentioned with sedges, those triangular stems, but those types of things can help you get down to family sometimes. They're kind of unique. So get a hold of the plant. I mentioned lots of pictures. Feel of it, see how it feels. Soft, rough. Don't do that with bull nettle. That would hurt. But with a lot of plants, get a feel of them and see if you can find anything that seems different to you. That can help you identify things sometimes. Most of these in the mint family, they are good for pollinators, but typically not great forage plants. But again, have been important, are important to us commercially sometimes, like lavender or horehound here, which you see on the left side of this picture. I don't know if you may have heard of horehound candy, which you can still find in some kind of a classic drugstore type shops, antique shops. You might see horehound candy. It's got a very distinctive smell. So most of these tend to have a lot of odors. That's the other thing when you're trying to identify a plant. That's often one of the first things I'll do is crush the leaves or the flowers and see if it's got an odor. That can be diagnostic sometimes for you and may help you get down to at least the mint family pretty quickly. And a couple of mint species. Here we got mealy sage, which is, of course, a salvia. There's lots of different species of salvia, all in the mint family. Common, mealy sage, really common range plant, especially in the plateau, the Edwards Plateau. And then bee balm or horse mint here on the right, good pollinator plant, really attractive flower. Again, also in the mint family, you can see they look very different, but again, they both have pretty distinctive odors, distinctive smells. If you crush them, can help you get them down to that mint family. Lilies, and I know I'm getting close to one here, and I'm getting close to the end, so I'll try and get through these and have time to get to some of your questions. Lilies, I mentioned lilies just because this is, again, gives you an idea of what to look at when you're trying to get a plant down to species. The thing with lilies is what's distinctive is the parallel veins. You can see in this picture, center of that picture, the leaves have veins that run from the base all the way to the tip. Most leaves, most plants other than grasses, lilies, and some others, they tend to branch off, right? You think of that typical leaf vein pattern. There's a central vein, and then a bunch of little veins that branch off like rivers or creeks coming off that main vein. Parallel veins are pretty characteristic. They can help you identify a plant much faster if you notice that veination. Notice those parallel veins. If you see a small flower or plant, whether it's got a flower or not, it's got those parallel veins. There's only there's a limited number of things that it's going to be. So that can be really helpful. That's why I mentioned lilies here. We have a rain lily here on the right. I've seen a lot of rain lilies this year because of all the rain we've had. They tend to pop up right after a heavy rain, dry spell and a heavy rain, and you get rain lilies popping up really in short order. Can be quite impressive. So, and that, of course, that distinctive lily type flower. What you think of, that tends to be pretty characteristic too. But without that flower, those parallel veins in and of themselves can help you get it down to at least the family, the lily family. Mallows, I mentioned these just because it's kind of a neat family. Covers, they've got some really nice showy flowers as well. And what I find particularly interesting here, these have, again, if you're down there messing with the plant, breaking it apart, you'll find in the flower in particular, you'll find in the mallow family, they have this mucilage, this mucilaginous sap around the flower. And that is distinctive to the mallow family. So think okra. Think that what a lot of people don't like about okra, but what makes it a great food is that slimy texture. That's the mucilaginous stuff in there, in that seed pod is, and okra's in the mallow family. So that's really distinctive. So again, if you're picking the plant, feel that flower and you feel that sticky, kind of slimy stuff coming out, that gives you a good idea that it's a mallow. Mallows are good for deer, good for pollinators, and the seeds are really important for a lot of them. We've got a wine cup here in the center, that reddish plant. Many of you know the wine cup, distinctive, one of our popular spring wildflowers. wine cup is a good example of a mallow. And then Indian mallow, should be Indian mallow there on the right. Again, another fairly common one. Nice flowers, nice soft leaves on those, on Indian mallow and some other of the big mallows that are related to it. Nice soft fluffy leaves, almost velvety type leaves as well. So, but not all of them. That's not necessarily characteristic, but there are quite a few that have that soft velvety leaf. Nightshades, I mentioned, again, a lot of these are thought of as weeds, very much so, but they are good for pollinators. And a lot of them produce seeds or fruits that are good for wildlife. A lot of our crops, important crops, potatoes, tomatoes, are nightshades. And nightshades, as you may know, a lot of them are toxic. Of course, the ones we eat, potatoes, tomatoes, those aren't toxic, but can be toxic to livestock. And what's toxic to livestock isn't necessarily always toxic to all wildlife either. So you got to keep that in mind. There are animals that have evolved to dine on things that may be quite dangerous for livestock or people to eat. So just because it's toxic to one doesn't mean it's toxic to others. And even these that may be highly toxic may still provide benefits to pollinators or others. Again, tend to have, if you think of a tomato plant, and that's what you're going to get with a lot of nightshades. The fruits look like little tomatoes on something like silverleaf nightshade. You can see the pictures here to the right. Looks like a tiny little tomato fruit. So that's fairly distinctive. If you can find those when they're in fruit, it looks like a tiny little tomato, and sometimes they're black or yellow or lots of different colors, not necessarily red in color, but they look like tiny little tomatoes. That's most likely a nightshade in the nightshade family, at least. And silverleaf nightshade's one of the more common ones. I think quite an attractive little flower. Again, often thought of as a nasty little weed because it can be toxic to livestock if they consume too much of it. Again, livestock generally aren't out looking for toxic plants. They're not going to go graze on all the poisonous plants unless there's absolutely nothing else to eat and they're really hungry. But this can be toxic to wildlife, but important pollinator plant, and the seeds are again important for a lot of different wildlife to eat. So, all right, I got through that, and I'm only 3 minutes over, and I'll get some of your questions. I want to mention some common guides. There are a lot of guides out there. This Botany in a Day is one that approaches things from a family perspective, help you identify a plant family. That'll get you down to and help you really kind of narrow down, again, your choices when you're doing comparisons. So if you like that approach, that might be a book worth checking out for you. Range Plants in North Central Texas by Ricky Lennox. This is an excellent book, primarily because Ricky's with the NRCS in North Central Texas, and fantastic plant guy. And a wonderful resource. But what he's done in this book is he realizes that a single picture of a flower doesn't necessarily help you identify a plant when there's no flower or when it looks a little different. So his book contains lots of different pictures of each plant, the whole plant, the close-up of the flower, maybe a close-up of the leaf, to demonstrate the variability in that plant and to give you different pictures of it. So that's a really good approach to identification. That's kind of it's not a pocket book. It's pretty good size, 8.5 by 11 or bigger sheets, but really good book to have. And I know it says North Central Texas, but a lot of the plants in there are common throughout much of the state. So that's a good one to pick up. There are, of course, many regional guides. Depending on where you are, you can probably find a wildflower or a grass guide for your region, which can reduce at least the number of plants, number of pages you have to look through in order to find and try to identify what you're looking for. Some websites that are helpful. I can't stress enough the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center Native plant database is fantastic. I often go there first because they have lots of good pictures. You can search by the color or by the season of the bloom or by the stature of the plant. Is it an herb, a forb? Is it a shrub? Is it a tree? Lots of different characteristics by state. Lots of good. It's a good search engine for finding plants to compare to. So a good way to narrow down the list of plants you want to compare to. And if you know the family, you can just search by family and then pull up a list of all the plants in that family and then narrow it down to the state, and you've got a good list to work off of. And it's a great database. iNaturalist, I mentioned you ought to look at this. You can look at the website or download the app. Again, the nice thing about iNaturalist is you take a picture or two or three, upload them into the app, and the software will actually try to make a suggestion for you. Okay, so it'll try to match it to known pictures with image recognition and make a suggestion. And of course, the quality of the picture affects that, but it's pretty good, especially with, I find a lot of distinctive insects. It gets pretty darn close. I took a picture of a wolf spider once with a bunch of babies on its back, and it got down to a couple of different species with one picture, and based on not only what it looked like, but where I was. And I was really impressed with it. We've actually done a webinar on how to use iNaturalist in the past, and unfortunately, a lot of our recordings were lost when we switched providers, but hopefully we'll do that one again for those of you interested. But pretty easy to use, and again, even if you're not sure what it is, you can just post the picture and let other people make suggestions for you. So it's kind of access to, oh, Molly says we still have that one, and it's on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Molly. So if you're interested in iNaturalist, go check that one out. It's again a quick way to get access to experts without having to go down or email a university and try to find somebody because they're already on that platform and can help make suggestions for identification. Really good way to learn not just plants but all sorts of wild things. And a couple others here, again, the USDA plants website, very comprehensive database of plants. The pictures aren't always the greatest, but it can be a good place to find lots of detailed information about different species. And then A&M has a range plants identification tool that might be helpful for you as well. So lots of different tools. There's more than that, but those are some common ones that we'll use. Don't forget, we're a family of companies as well, and I will get to any questions I've got, serving all of rural landowners' needs, from estate planning and condemnation and conservation law to buying and selling rural real estate as well. And with that, I will thank you all, and I appreciate your patience in me running a little bit over today. A lot of information. I hope you took something away useful. Again, if you have other questions or need more information, feel free to email us or email me. We do tend to we have a list of common field guides we like to use. If you've gotten one of our plans, you may have it already, but if anybody's interested in that, just shoot an email. We'll send you that list of field guides that we like to use if you're looking for some new field guides to use. But if you don't want to buy one, go download iNaturalist. It's kind of like a field guide for everything in your pocket. So, and I've got one question here, and I got to thank you, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you all for joining us. We got one question. When you mentioned poisonous, are they poisonous to humans or other wildlife? So that can be typically both, or either. I mentioned, I may have briefly answered this. Just because it's toxic to livestock, usually when you see a plant is toxic, poisonous, depending on the guide you're looking at, they're talking about livestock. That's common because a lot of these are range plant, and so they're focused on livestock. If you're looking, of course, at a wild edibles, a wild foraging guide, it's probably going to be related to humans. But most of these, if they're toxic or poisonous, to some extent, they're probably toxic to both humans and livestock, but it depends on dose, right? It doesn't mean that if you eat a little bit of it, it's going to kill you, but it's probably going to taste really bad. Those toxins are just chemicals plants use to keep other things from eating them. And so, but the nightshades are a good example. So you wouldn't want to eat a bunch of nightshade berries, but you do eat nightshade berries all the time. They're called tomatoes. Okay? But silverleaf nightshade berries might make you feel pretty bad. Tomatoes make me feel happy. So it varies from plant to plant. And of course, cultivated crops are often bred to get those toxins out of them as well. So, and again, just because it's unpalatable or toxic to one type of one species of wildlife doesn't mean it's toxic to all of them. And so there are almost certainly animals that have evolved to feed on pretty much any of these plants. Milkweeds don't get eaten much, but caterpillars eat them specifically because they're toxic. So